Hello, everybody, and welcome to the third episode of Beyond Talking Points. Today, we're going to just cover a hodgepodge of stories that we kind of gathered up over the last week. Me and I'm obviously Matt, and my co-host Matthew is here, and we're going to discuss different things we pieced together and found. It really is a random collection of things we saw and said, "Ooh, this is interesting. Let's talk about it." Some things aren't like super newsworthy; you might not have heard of them, but they're just things that different people on the campaign trail have brought up, or different reports or studies that came out. So it is really a total random episode, a random selection of stories. So just to dive in, the first story we're going to talk about, it came out at the end of April. I saw it, but we hadn't had a chance to discuss it. I saw it in Reason magazine. So they're more of a libertarian-based magazine, and the headline is "Social Security will be insolvent in 16 years." So pretty much the beats of the story are simple. By 2035, Social Security will be unable to pay the full value of its promised benefits. So it's kind of pointing out how unsustainable our current model is for Social Security, and nobody's really talking about it, which is why I like this story. Social Security is kind of a huge issue. I've had my eye on it for like 5 or 6 years, and we get really little discussion about it. And then the other thing that I want to mention is it did run down the other entitlements that are like Medicare and Medicaid. And I also mentioned that Medicare Part A, which is for hospital and nursing home costs, will also be insolvent by 2026. So that's not good. Um, so I guess, did you have any first thoughts when I linked this story and sent it over to you? I don't know how much you think about this issue, so I just kind of shot it out there.
No, to be honest, I don't have too many thoughts on it. I'm not expert enough to, check their facts.
Okay, so one of the things that's always irritated me about Social Security as an issue is there's so like little information about it all over the place. So when I was wrapping up college, I would check out a bunch of random books on random issues, and the only book I could find about Social Security and only Social Security was like essentially an 80-page like little paperback book. The most interesting thing when you just read about the history of Social Security is comparing how many people paid into it when it was first signed into law compared to now. So like when it was originally during FDR's administration, when they created Social Security, I think it was either 12 to 14 Americans per person who was collecting. So now it's about 2.5. Which is why, unless you like raise the rates of how much you tax those people, it quickly becomes insolvent. Also, like the trust fund that they built because they taxed people and they actually weren't paying out as much was later used on other programs. So it's not like they kept a fund separate. It's kind of all fungible to the government. So they didn't really benefit from all the time that they were gaining way more funds than they were using, which is pretty bad. And I do want to add that I went to one economics conference in my life so far, and Keith, what's his name, Keith Hall from the Congressional Budget Office, gave this long lecture where he essentially went over all these government programs, and this is an issue that he talked about at length, and how Social Security is just growing rapidly, and same with the federal debt. So there's cause to be concerned about it. The main way that I see people fixing it are that there's currently a cap on Social Security for how much you pay into it. So if you make like, I want to say it's $200-something thousand a year, you only get taxed up to that level. And then after that, you don't pay Social Security tax anymore on your income. So there are obvious ways for them to keep it afloat by raising that cap. And currently, Social Security is like universal. You don't have to be poor. So like Bill Gates could collect Social Security. So if they make it so people who are like Bill Gates can't, that might make it a little bit more solvent. But it's just a shame that like nobody's tackling this in any way right now. Nobody in the 2020 field is talking about it. Trump's not talking about it. It's just a non-issue.
I really wish I had something constructive to say here.
It's well, and then that comes to the difficulty of it too, right? Is the solutions aren't obvious and it affects so many people.
I think these Sorry, I don't mean to interrupt.
No, go ahead.
I was just going to make a banal point that when these programs were created, I think there was a clear need for them when they were created, but I think times change, and we have to reevaluate our need and what works and what doesn't.
Yeah, and
I
the
mean,
thing.
we keep interrupting each other.
I thought you were wrapping up your point there. I was just going to add that the few times people brought up ways to maybe fix it, the only time recently was George W. Bush, and after he was a lame duck president essentially, and he called on Congress to do something, and he wanted to privatize it, which I think there's a lot of misinformation, I guess, about what privatizing it would mean. Um, like if you really think about Social Security, like if you argued that we still need it, it's because we don't want older people to become impoverished, and if they can't work, what are they going to do? They need at least some money to stay afloat. So like, I guess the way if you could privatize it by essentially doing like I would say call it quote unquote forced savings, and then if you at least put 8% or however much the Social Security taxes into your own fund, then it's going to be there for you no matter what because it's your fund. Now, the issue is if you work at McDonald's and it's all your taxes going to your fund, your retirement fund is going to be way less than a hedge fund manager. And that's where there's a problem there. So there's always going to be this kind of debate could happen, but it's so unpopular that it's just not going to. And it's just looming as an issue. Like, like it's getting worse and worse. So yeah, if you don't have any more thoughts on it, we can move on to the next topic. But if you do, feel free to wrap it up.
I think there are a lot of issues with the way government is run right now that will not be able to last. I don't think Social Security is just one of them. But as I say, I don't. I'm sorry. I wish I had more, knew more about it. But as I said, I think in a previous episode, I hate to just talk out of my ass. Excuse my language.
Yeah, and the last thing I will say before we move on is if anybody just I guess thinks this is a non-issue, I would just recommend they look up a graph of federal spending and then look at how much Social Security is as a share compared to things like other mandatory spending and the military, because yeah, it's comparable with the military. So that's a lot of money. And it's going to affect people who are in our age range. I think people who are our age, so like the 18 to 40-year-old range, is people who's going to get hit the worst by this. Because in 2035, I'm going to be like 40. 40-year-olds are going to be close to like 50, late 50s or 60. So they're going to be way thinking about retirement, and then they're going to find out it's insolvent, and they don't know what to do. So yeah.
Alrighty, next story then.
Yep.
Did we agree on Andrew Yang yet? 'Cause I forgot.
Yeah, we did.
Okay. So I actually learned about this on when I watched his town hall, CNN town hall. So I looked it up on his website. He one thing I like about Mr. Yang is he has a very, I mean, not extremely detailed, but he has a little bit for most policies he would advocate. He has a little bit of information for it. So he has what he calls a news and information ombudsman, and basically what it would be is an organization, a federal organization, which would curb fake news. He said in his town hall that places like CNN and Fox News, he didn't say Fox News, he said CNN, I think. CNN wouldn't have a problem with it 99% of the time. He said it's the people who are deliberately trying to misinform that would have something to worry about under this organization. Now, perhaps he just hasn't put forth enough information about it, but I wanted to talk about this because I am just very, very suspicious of it.
Oh, okay.
One of those curveballs again.
No, this is good because a funny thing that's going on in this show is I'm kind of predictable, but Matt Matthew is not as predictable as I am. So when he brings up this issue, I kind of since I know that he generally feels favorably towards like Andrew Yang and Tulsi Gabbard, I expected like unadulterated praise for this idea, and I was just ready to go on a rant. But it might not sound as argumentative now. So yeah, go ahead. Tell me why you're skeptical of this.
I am always skeptical about censorship. I mean, that sounds kind of like a silly platitude. So let me clarify. Everybody knows that in certain situations, your free speech needs to be curtailed. Obviously, there are certain situations. You know, if I start, you know, making threats to the president, and the government thinks that I am a legitimate threat, then there will be consequences. I think was it Oliver Wendell Holmes who said you can't yell fire in a crowded theater. So I mean, I understand there are some limitations, but I am pretty close to a free speech absolutist. Again, I'm not exactly that far, but I'm very close to it, and I'm just very suspicious of the government telling me what is and what is not fake news. I just think fake news is one of those terms that is very hard to pin down. I don't think it's going to be so simple as, oh, you know, he's deliberately misinforming. You know, what exactly is deliberate misinformation?
Yeah.
I would rather decide on my own what I think is fake news or not, rather than have the government tell me, okay, this is fake news, you can't listen to it.
Yeah, so when I first saw this, I had the idea of, okay, we have an executive, a part of the FCC, part of the executive branch, all about news and information watchdog against fake news. Now imagine somebody said that and they're like, that's cool, Andrew Yang is president. And then 4 years later, you get somebody like Donald Trump and president. Not Donald Trump, because he obviously wouldn't. Well, I mean, if he did get beat in 2020, I guess he could be president again in 2024. So he gets elected again. And now you have somebody you don't like who suddenly is in control of this branch of the FCC that can attack news that he finds, unpalatable. So I just thought giving the executive more power on this front is just a bad idea, even though I don't think Andrew Yang would be the person to abuse it, because he doesn't seem like that kind of person. But I'm just like, oh, do I want a federal? It's worse because it's also the executive branch. So it's like, yeah, there's not a lot of check on that. It's just not good precedent to set. The other thing I didn't like about this is this kind of struck me as a very politician piece of this website specifically, like this web page. It's just so candidate running for office, and it's talking about issues that this clearly won't fix. So he essentially says the problems to be solved. He has 4 bullet points, and one of them is disincentives to publish inflammatory information are weak or non-existent. So it's like, well, you're talking about inflammatory information. A lot of clickbait that people click on and gets them angry, it's not fake news. It's just an angle on it, right? So if you go on Daily Wire, it's very right-wing slanted, and a lot of times it is kind of inflammatory. They cover stuff that will rile you up, but it's not fake news. It's stuff that is true, then they just tackle it from a certain angle. And I don't think it's the government's job to disincentivize that, even if it's like, quote, in Andrew Yang's term, bad for democracy. He complains that he even puts a sentence in here, quote, the lack of trusted news increasingly isolates us in information silos that hurt our democracy. That sentence has nothing to do with news that is factually inaccurate. Like, you can be driven to watch stuff that's all left-wing or all right-wing, but that doesn't mean it's fake, and that's not the reason why you're doing it. So it just seems like this isn't going to resolve the issues that he is stating in the context of this policy. So I just thought, I'm like, okay, you're talking about these things, and it's like, I agree that's not a good thing. And then I read about what the ombudsman is supposed to do, and I'm like, okay, that's not the same thing. These aren't issues to be conflated. So this is like just a bad piece of policy, in my opinion. I did not like it. I'm glad that you didn't fully fledge your support. And then obviously the freedom of speech part. It's like, how do you decide that they're doing it intentionally? Sometimes people make good faith errors. Sometimes if your industry is based around putting information out there fast, you might make good faith errors a lot. But a lot of people can screen cap things, send it into somebody, and say, look at all these times they got it wrong on the first jump. Even if they correct it, it's like, well, how do you decide? This is very subjective, and you might be shutting down companies. So I'm not a fan, as you can tell.
I wanted to bring up one more point. I appreciate you you're going on that rant, because it kind of segues into another quote from that website. Quote, mistrust of media is at an all-time high, making it very difficult to form a consensus on solutions or common goals. I don't remember if you brought up that quote.
Oh, I hate that quote. I'm so glad you brought it up.
Because I do hear this a lot. I hear people bring up, in the 1950s, I think it was the 1950s, we had Walter Cronkite, and everyone watched Walter Cronkite, and everybody, they knew he was giving it straight. We didn't have to worry about fake news, but there was no one else. I mean, there was like 3 networks, I think, at the beginning of television, if I remember correctly. Well, no, the beginning of television, there's probably 1, but later on, I guess there was 3. Like, was it NBC, CBS,
it's
and
before
ABC?
it's before all the networks came in. So there was very few choice. There was little choice to have.
So there was very few, and I think. I mean, you can argue that a mistrust of media is an issue, but I think that's just an issue that we have to deal with, not by curbing, or not by labeling something fake news. So, if we seem more divided as a country, as a world, or however you want to put it, I think it's just because we are getting more information than ever. But I think the getting more information is a good thing. I don't think curbing that information, I don't think labeling some of that information as Fox News, or as fake news, excuse me, or labeling that's the Freudian slip right there, I think. Labeling it as fake news or banning it. I don't think that's the issue. I think we need to try to make sure that as individuals, we need to educate people to be able to make those decisions on their own.
Yeah, and I like the quote you pointed out, because it perpetuates this fallacy that I think most educated people on the left make nowadays. And this is on the people who try to pretend like they're not ideological, and they imply that if we all have the same set of facts, of course we'd come to the same set of conclusions. And that's clearly not the case. People have different subjective values of all kinds of things. Some people don't think like owning a gun is a thing that people should be able to do, and some people think everybody should be allowed to own a gun. This is not a thing that is like based on a set of facts generally. It's generally like, do I believe that we all have rights to defend ourselves, or should we like leave the police to do it after I call 911? So it's like a thing where everybody can have access to the same information. Now, different parts of that information support one argument more than another at times, but that doesn't mean if we all had access to it all, we'd agree on the same thing. I feel like that's like a fallacy that people imply all the time. And I think the mistrust in news is just, I think that's more of I don't think that's because news is deliberately false. I think that's because there's so much opinion journalism that people mistake for factual journalism. And that's why I comfortably equate CNN and Fox News, is because every time I see CNN on, it's just opinion journalism from the generally center left. I think they're more left than center, but it's center left opinion journalism. Fox News is just like usually mediocre right-wing takes that aren't always that smart. And they're not always that thoughtful. And I listen to opinion journalists that I like because I feel like they provide decent reasoning that I'm interested in. That's essentially what we're doing. We're covering stories with our opinion. We aren't trying to be mistaken for reporters, but people do mistake people like Don Lemon as a reporter when he's giving his left-wing opinion. So yeah, I think that's the real issue. I don't think it's the disinformation campaigns. I don't know anybody who gets their news from like weird, sketchy websites. People just go on Twitter and then they follow like New York Times and the Washington Post, and they just see it on Twitter. So yeah, that's but I'm going to transition into our next topic. So this is a policy that Kirsten Gillibrand has supported, and the reason it jumped out to me is because in the city of Philadelphia they discussed doing something similar to this before. So I was already familiar with it, and when I saw it, I was like, oh boy, this on a federal level. So let's check it out. The headline on Reason Magazine once again is Gillibrand proposes giving every voter $600 to donate to campaigns. The Democratic senator and 2020 presidential hopeful calls it her, quote, clean elections plan. She describes this money as democracy dollars. It's a taxpayer-funded venture that's supposed to clean up elections and, quote, attack the corrupting influence of money at its core. So the idea is all eligible voters would qualify for the lump sum, which would be doled out in $200 payments for each individual's House, Senate, and presidential candidate of choice. And she later discusses that it would be paid for by closing, quote unquote, closing a tax loophole. I'm putting that in my own quotes. The story doesn't put that in quotes. Closing a tax loophole, because I think that phrase should always be in quotes, on CEOs' salaries. So she essentially says CEOs have a tax deductible that she wants to close. That's what a tax loophole is. It's a deductible that they don't like, so they want to close it, and they currently call it a tax loophole. That's why I take such offense at that phrasing of it. I find it a little bit dishonest. But she essentially says we'll get the money by closing a loophole for the rich. So, yeah, I feel like you might kind of like this, which is why I brought it up too, because I know you're very much more on the getting money out of elections. So this kind of spreads it out more. But I obviously, as you would guess, I'm not a fan. I don't think you should publicly fund campaigns because what about? Okay, well, one, she commits a fallacy that I don't like. She essentially says it's not coming out of taxpayer money; it's coming out of these specific rich people. You have to remember that government money is fungible because just because this will specifically add more revenue to make up for the increased cost doesn't mean it's directly going to that. All the money essentially goes into the same place and they take money from it. So implying that it's just money from the rich in general is a mischaracterization. That's just how you're raising revenues to meet the new cost. So some people, it's still coming out of the taxpayer pool money. Some people don't want to support any campaign, any people running for office. I don't really like anybody who has a reasonable chance of winning House, Senate, or President in 2020. I already know that because my candidates of choice pull up probably like under 1% because I'm a libertarian. So if I want to give somebody money to somebody who like might have a chance of winning, then it's going to go to a Republican. I don't really want to fund Republicans though because I don't like their ideas. So now you're using taxpayer money to fund Republicans, even though I don't even like Republicans. Okay, I just don't see why that's a remotely good idea. It's also been done before in Seattle, and in Seattle they found that it pretty much only benefited incumbents because people who got this money and actually thought to use it gave it to the names they recognized, and the names they recognized were almost always the incumbents. So it didn't actually help people in primaries get funding easier that are like less well known, maybe running against the incumbent in the primary spot. It just was like, oh, I get this free money. I like the incumbent, so I give it to the incumbent. So yeah, bad idea. I hope nobody else picks this up.
Let me ask you a question, so I can clarify something.
Yeah.
Now, did she? I haven't reread the article since I read it the first time, so that's why I'm asking you. Did she say that each citizen would have to donate that $600, or is it just an option, like you can if you want to?
Well, so everybody is qualified to take like the $600 from the government and give it, but nobody has to. In Seattle, where it was tried, a very like single-digit percentage of people did it.
Okay. I'm also skeptical of this. I'm sorry to keep giving you throwing you curveballs. I don't see that as helpful.
I'll add this because I think this might affect you. And I probably should have mentioned it. It says only candidates who refuse to accept individual contributions over 200 would be allowed to cash in on democracy dollars. The current limit is 2,800, which candidates could still opt to accept if they forgo the publicly funded vouchers. So the idea is you would, by making this a thing, people wouldn't be able to accept more than like a certain amount of money from individuals to get this. So it would lead to more people opting out of taking huge contributions in favor of trying to get more small ones. So I think when I read that, that's when I thought you might be more of a fan of this than I am.
So she's arguing that you have to, or that a candidate can't take more than a certain amount of money to cash in on these $600.
Yeah.
You know, maybe I'm being short-sighted here, but I don't see how that's going to do much.
Yeah.
I don't. You know, it kind of. I'm not gonna. It's not compelled speech, but it kind of rings that. It kind of reminds me of that.
Well, that's the argument that Reason magazine actually makes at the end of this piece. They pretty much challenge it on those grounds, and I'm actually not sympathetic to that because I think taxpayer money is fungible. So I don't really see it as the rich specifically paying for it. I just see it as you take it out of the tax pool, and because it's so spread out in the tax pool, I don't know if that really applies. I just think the issue is this isn't the role of government. This won't achieve any ends that you want. It's just going to empower incumbents in primaries. It just seems like, and I don't even like, we're already seeing money get pulled out of politics through natural ways. Like a lot of the top 2020 Democratic candidates aren't taking big donor money or aren't taking oil money, etc. So,
well, that's what I.
Go ahead. Go ahead. I was wrapping up my point anyways. That's fine.
That's what I want to see. I want to see politicians taking, $20 from whoever wants to give them $20 or something. I don't. I'm not very keen on a government program saying that, okay, here's $600. Bob, go give it to whoever you want.
Yeah, no, that's okay. I'm glad we're in agreement on this one. It just, it just, I don't know. I don't know what Gillibrand's thinking. But yeah, let's move on to what you were the story that you sent me yesterday about the environment.
Yes. So I got this off of The Guardian, headlined Human Society Under Urgent Threat from Loss of Earth's Natural Life. Scientists reveal 1 million species at risk of extinction in damning UN report. Now, I could go over all the different statistics they give in the article, but you can go look it up yourself. I'm more interested in my take on this, if that's all right.
Yeah, that's fine.
I think it's pretty, I'm not a climate scientist, but I think it's pretty obvious that that climate change is happening, and I think it's also very obvious that we need. Well, I should say there are two more obvious points. So it's obvious that it's happening. I think it's obvious that partly to blame from human activity, not completely, but partly, and that something needs to be done about it. And I kind of brought it up because I'm just tired of this being a political sticking point between people. I think there's some debate as to what exactly should be done about it in terms of policy, but I think anybody who's not living under a rock would acknowledge that something has to be done about it, if only for the self-interest of human society itself. I'm not going to go into an argument, the poor polar bears, because, well, one, I don't really like it when people pull the emotional strings, but two, I don't think that's going to convince some people. I think it's really a matter of, do we want to continue on existing? and if we do, I think we need to make some big changes.
Okay, so we have a lot of agreement on your basic 3-point principles. I think I guess I have a lot of broad thoughts on this issue, so I'm not going to talk specifically about the argument. This was kind of just a way for us to, for the first time, I guess, really discuss what we feel about climate change. So I think one of the surprising things, I don't think Republicans deny climate change. I just think they're having a communication issue, right? So all the left does is talk about climate change. And when the left talks about climate change, they assume that the proper action is heavily government-based to tackling it. If you listen to the right talk about climate change, they just say nothing. And they just say, oh, look, that idea sucks. And they don't explain an alternative. And they don't even say why doing nothing is preferable to that. They just say that's a bad idea. So you have this communication error where the Republicans don't offer an alternative and the left just says things that I find absolutely crazy. There's a thinker named Alex Epstein. He considers himself like a philosopher, but he does a ton of stuff on the environmental front. He used to work for the Ayn Rand Institute. I'm pretty sure he has a podcast where he does like an hour a week all about energy issues. And he wrote this really provocative book with a great title. It's called The Moral Case for Fossil Fuels. Wow, that's provocative. His whole thesis is we should be talking about human flourishing. We need to be honest about the trade-offs of all these alternative kinds of energies. And because once we acknowledge these trade-offs in the current moment, this is the benefits of why we still use fossil fuels. And then these are the trade-offs we have to address on other types before we can move forward. Now, the issue right now is all about public perception. Though the left never talks about nuclear energy, even though nuclear energy is pretty clean in all the ways that all the ways we've worked on it, now it's really clean. But nuclear has a horrible reputation because decades ago, tragedies happened. Yeah, sorry, I'm just ranting. So feel free to interrupt.
No, you're fine. I wanted to actually come in, for 2 points, actually. You mentioned nuclear energy. It's funny. My grandmother, who's long since passed away, unfortunately, she was a very committed left-wing individual, and she was a part of her life was spent as a anti-nuclear power activist. So she wrote several books about it, none well known, but so my family is because of that, maybe partly for emotional attachment, who knows, is partly very against nuclear energy. I'm a bit more open about it. I'd have to study it more. I'm not completely condemning nuclear energy like my family does. And one other thing I mentioned, or I wanted to mention, I think I think people get confused when people say, I mean, you hear a lot of people saying, oh, fossil fuels aren't sustainable. I think that's a bit of a miscommunication, because it's not that we're running out of fossil fuels per se, which I don't think is true. I think, from what I understand, the fossil fuels are becoming far more expensive and tedious to get at, but there are still quite a bit of fossil fuels to be mined.
Yeah, the issue with the real issue with fossil fuels is what they release into the atmosphere. People always act like we need renewable energy. Like the problem with fossil fuels is the fact that it's non-renewable. But what happens with fossil fuels is every time the prices are skyrocketing and we feel like the supply is low, it spurs a bunch of people to look for more, and then people invariably find more every time. So then it's like, oh, now we found this new thing, and nobody looks for a while because everything's fine. We have a ton. So yeah, the problem isn't that it's non-renewable, at least like for a while. That's not going to be the issue. And there are plenty of places where people haven't looked. So I don't think that's the problem. The issue is the emissions as a result of it. I've read a few books all about renewable energy, and people on the left don't talk about the trade-offs. They just talk about like, oh, wind and solar, wind and solar, wind and solar. I think massive technological innovations are going to be what changes everything. So the issue with solar right now is you can't really store energy from solar panels. If you have solar panels and you're using electricity in your house while the sun's out, then the electricity comes in and it powers your house. And if you're not using all of it, then it goes into the grid and then powers other people. But it's not a consistent supply of energy, because you can have days where it's not sunny. And then at certain times of the day, like maybe like the angle the sun's coming at, you just won't get energy. So it makes the electricity plants that use traditional forms of energy, it makes them have to act in a inconsistent manner to balance the energy shifts from solar. because solar doesn't consistently generate the same amount. So they have to use these other things, and they have to suddenly increase output. So the way that they have to now change their output schedule is inefficient, right? So even though you think, oh, it's better because they use more solar, the way that solar changes the grid, they have to inefficiently use their fossil fuels. So on per unit, it becomes dirtier, even though overall the net's slightly lower. So it's like there's still these issues when you do use solar. It's actually not benefiting things the same way, and it usually makes energy cost more, even though they're subsidized. So there's like clearly all these problems with wind and solar that people don't talk about because they sound cool and easy, and they don't have stigma like nuclear or fossil fuels. I think the real issue here is most people aren't informed. They try to simplify it to being obviously the right doesn't care, and obviously the left knows what to do. So it's just like oversimplification, or people just don't know about the trade-offs. I don't know all the answers, obviously. I think hopefully there's going to be some big technological innovation in the next 20 years. I think if solar panels can harness energy better, and also if they can vastly improve battery storage of power in solar panels, that'll be a huge innovation. And I don't know about wind, because wind kills hundreds of thousands of birds every year, because birds fly into them and get murdered all the time. So I actually don't know how much hope there is for winds, because that's a huge ecological disaster. Like there's like a genocide on bats because of wind power. Like it's crazy when you look up the stuff about it. So I actually don't have as much hope for wind, but solar, if they do some innovations, and nuclear, I think, is where the future is. There's also some like really weird ones based on like I don't know. There's a few other weird ones like geothermal that might have some potential too. But yeah, so I love that it's an issue that we can talk about. I hate that nobody's having discourse that will actually fix anything, because right now it's just the Green New Deal sucks. No, it's good. No, it sucks. No, it's good. And I hate that.
I think I agree with you when you say we're looking for efficiency. I think there's nothing to disagree with there. And certainly there are trade-offs which the left needs to acknowledge. I think we might have to make some trade-offs. I mean, I'm not convinced that our way of life now, that everything about it will be completely transferable to the future. But I hope some of it is.
Yeah.
Because, I like the internet. I like having a car. I like living in a city. There are aspects of modern civilization that I do hope certainly do continue on.
So it does raise one thing that I did want to mention that I kind of didn't mention in my rant, surprisingly, even though I did. I feel like I covered a lot there. The issue is international. It's not a domestic
Absolutely.
issue.
Absolutely. Which is why I don't know how you feel about this actually, but I was very upset when the president took us out of the Paris Accord.
Yeah, I mean, I don't like symbolic, useless stuff. And Paris Climate Accord was a what's the word for it? It wasn't a binding contract. It was just like random goals with no enforcement mechanisms. So like, I guess the symbolism is worth something, but I guess I don't value it very much. And it's definitely was not a sticking point for me. I was pissed about it until I found out that it was a non-binding piece of the legislation, and then I didn't really care after. But it's a talking point that hurts Trump all the time. But maybe we can debate about that more. But the one thing I did want to get at with it being an international issue is our way of life in the West. Sure, it's definitely not helping the environment. But if you look at the worst offenders, it's the nations that are not first world nations, or they're like, and they still predominantly use very, very dirty vehicles. They have like cities that are using like the least clean types of energy in very inefficient manners. And then this is a lot of like Asia, like developing areas in Asia. So that's why like the Green New Deal would have had such little impact on the net climate when people talked about it, right? So it was saying, let's make trillions of dollars of trade-off for a 0.2 degree change over like 50 or 70 years. It's because our nation alone, even if we changed every single building in the country and made it so cars were illegal and that cows didn't fart, it's like all these things, and yet it makes almost no change because there are huge offenders all over the world. So yeah, I mean, I do think there should be international like policy. I'd hope so, but I don't know what the international answers are because those countries use dirty energy because that's the only affordable stuff for them, right?
Can I push you back on that a little bit?
Yeah, go for it.
We have a few minutes left.
Yeah, we got time.
I mean, I agree that there were. I won't go too much into the Paris Accords. That there were a lot of problems with it, and I do think I think an international agreement like that should probably be made. The place where we might disagree some, I think it might be true. I'm not 100% on this, but it might be true that some of these poorer countries that you mentioned, that they might have to go through these growing pains to get to the level of freedom and luxury that we have. I mean, the Western countries went through these same growing pains. I mean, if you look back at the industrial capitalism in when it first began, I mean, the conditions for workers were horrible. The pollution was terrible. Disease was rampant in cities. So I do think I don't think we can. It doesn't have to be an either or position, I guess is what I'm saying. I agree that we need to try to get these poor nations to more efficient. We need to get them faster to efficient energy, but I do think the onus should be on the more wealthier countries that have already gone through these growing pains and they do have more leg room.
Yeah, I guess the reason why I kind of went in that direction with my thoughts on the issue is a lot of times when things are bad, there's a reason why it's bad, and it's not an easy fix. So when I think of why are these poor countries polluting so much, and it's because that's the cheapest thing for them, and they are very poor. A lot of the individuals in it are very poor, so they have to do it that way. And even in our own country, if we do some massive changes on the electric grid, everybody who's like you and me, who were pretty middle class, we won't be screwed over by it because we can afford to take on these like increases in price. But if poor people see their electric bills that they're already like essentially like making sure they use as little electricity as possible, if their rates increase by 50%, then suddenly they're hit with this shock and this monthly bill going up, say like $40 or $50 a month, maybe a lot more if they have like 3 kids. Then all of a sudden it's like, hell, they're spending like $900 more a year. And that's going to hit them harder when it affects the whole system. So it's one of those things where I see the issue, but it's hard for me to think of solutions that don't adversely affect the poor in a way that's large. I think a lot of things will grow out of it naturally, because I think as we improve, like there are people working on these technologies and they're going to become more efficient. And once they're more efficient, they'll be much more price competitive. So even if we do subsidize them, we don't subsidize them to a ridiculous degree. And the current ways we've subsidized solar have been stupid. That's why Son Edison like famously went bankrupt, even though they had hundreds of millions of dollars in government subsidies, because we were subsidizing a company that sells solar panels, not the companies that develop them. So like internationally, I think they have to grow through it, and I think we can't catastrophize the issue by making it sound like we have to do something urgent in the next day, because it's simply not possible. We just have to spur innovation in the private sector and hope that we get some big changes that make it more efficient. That's just the way I see it. Because when we talk about government solutions, I just am not hearing anything where I go, oh, that actually resolves said issue. It just sounds like it makes a minute change at the cost of like a ton of money. So
I think you mentioned this earlier. I don't remember if it was about this issue or not, but I wish I'm actually glad I brought that story up, because I think we are trying to illustrate two people who, although might not agree on every specific point on climate change, we're trying to have a discussion. We're trying to go somewhere with it. We're trying to come up with, I mean, as much as we can, as much as two podcasters can, come up with solutions. And I wish there was more of that. I mean, I think when I think about debates on climate change, I think of there was a debate a while back, I think on CNN again with Bill Nye and some, corporate guy. And I don't think it got a lot of it got. I don't think much came out of it, if I remember correctly.
Yeah. Well, and the way I see things, though, is there are tons of very rich people who go to Davos to talk about climate change. But any of them could easily invest $20 million into energy in a random South African country or an Asian country and be like, hey guys, please get your electricity from here. It's clean. And now I've powered this town and this will make a statement or something like that. Like there are things that people can do that aren't even on the innovation front, or people could just publicize the private sector companies that are trying to make innovations more to give them support. But yeah, we're trying to talk about it in a way where we're understanding the issue and then maybe what we can do about it, even though obviously we're not going to be the ones implementing anything. I think
not yet anyway.
Yeah,
I think the revolution is coming.
we made some good ground on it. I'm sure we'll talk about it more in detail another time, and maybe I'll have some more information at my hand so I can point out some of my concerns better instead of just vaguely alluding to bats getting murdered at high rates. Maybe I could point out the real numbers. I do want to talk about, before we run out of time, we have a little bit still. I want to talk about Facebook because Facebook had a wave of bans over the last week. They banned Alex Jones, Paul Joseph Watson, Milo, and I feel like one other person who I'm not remembering. And also I saw today, right before we recorded, on Twitter, a person who had a ACO parody account. Their parody account got banned, and their personal account, I'm pretty sure, got banned. And their parody account was good too, because I'm pretty sure it was a bot that took her tweets and just like reshuffled them in funny ways, and it sounded ridiculous, and it said parody in the name, and I'm pretty sure they got banned for that, and it was like a permanent ban. So people were talking about that as of today. So I'm not sure how you feel about Facebook and the tech giant censorship. You know that I listen to a lot of right-wing commentators that have come out strongly against Facebook censorship. I listened to a roundtable. Well, once again, I'm mentioning Reason Magazine. They're getting all the free advertisement from me. I listened to their podcast, and they're libertarians, and they discuss this whole wave of bannings.
Come advertise us, please, please, please.
Yeah, we need to lose as much credibility as possible, so we need to advertise. So I'm okay with Facebook banning people in the sense that I feel like they have the right to. I'm not okay with Facebook banning people because I think it's the worst way to fight ideas is to ban them and push them into the underground. People actually draw empowerment and validity from being banned. So if you actually think Alex Jones has despicable things to say, then banning him makes him feel empowered. He goes, wow, I'm on the truth. They're stopping me from getting to the truth. They even banned me. And it gives him this weird level of credibility that, he's being censored. And it draws more eyes to him instead of just letting him talk to people, and then people can debunk him in public. So I'm not a fan of the censorship. I think it's fine. I don't think there should be government regulation. I think it's fine in the sense of rights. I don't think anybody has right to be on Facebook or Twitter. That's where I think I could see you disagreeing with me in the sense that the arguments from like Tim Pool about Twitter censorship and stuff like that is more leaning towards regulation. So I don't know where you stand.
Just you mentioned there was one other person you forgot. I think it was. Did you mention Louis Farrakhan?
Oh no, I forgot. I knew I was forgetting somebody. Yeah, that's a pretty big important person who got banned too.
Yeah, kind of. Yeah, I feel like we're mostly agreeing in this episode. Actually, I think, Facebook is a big company. It's a big private company. Do they have the right to ban these people? As a company, probably. It's a private company. You can pretty much do whatever you want as long as you don't hurt anybody. But I think the question is, does Facebook, along with these other social media platforms, do they want to lose credibility? I think if they start banning a lot of people, they're just going to lose credibility and people are going to stop using them. So I think that is really, that would be, if I were talking to somebody at Facebook, that would be my, that's how I would phrase the argument. I don't, again, I'm pretty close to a free speech absolutist, so I'm always very suspicious or openly against bans or censorship generally. I don't think these people should have been. If I had been higher up in Facebook, I would not have banned these people.
Yeah.
But
So
that's my 2 cents.
yeah, so I feel that a lot. So if you listen to the episode of Joe Rogan where he has Tim Pool on, and then he has Jack Dorsey, and then he has a woman who also works at Twitter, and it's just Tim Pool and that woman discussing bans. And if I've like that made me delete my Twitter account for about a month and a half, and then I made a new one. Uh, because it probably wasn't a month and a half. It's probably for like a month, but it's just like I like Twitter. Like the interface is nice. But when they ban people, it's really indefensible. And clearly, their company policy is so disorganized and inconsistent that it just seems like they're pushing an agenda. And I'm not even a conspiracy-oriented guy by any means. I'm like, okay, Twitter can do whatever they want. I don't really care. If I don't like it, I won't use it. That's my normal chain of thought. And then I heard them for 2 hours try to explain their logic, and it was terrible. So, yeah, it definitely hurts their credibility. That's the overarching thing that you got at that I agreed with.
I think a lot of these companies are beginning to react out of fear. I think political correctness has begun to scare people, and I think so now. If you begin to have a reputation as somebody who, you might criticize something about Islam, or you might criticize some aspect of Black Lives Matter or the LGBTQIA plus community, what have you. I think these companies are beginning to fear, oh my God, if we have Alex Jones on Facebook, what's going to happen? So there's ban it out of fear of losing customers and losing credibility in that direction. But as I say, I don't think that's the credibility that they should be looking for.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. And the one thing I wanted to add is I'm not sure if you're familiar with some of the alternative social media sites that are coming up that are more free speech absolutists. I mean, I'd heard of Gab. I've never used Gab. I've been on Minds before, though, because Bill Ottman, the CEO, was on Joe Rogan. And I think he also was on Dave Rubin. So I checked them out. And I guess part of me wants to be like, bullish and excited for these for these sites because they are really embracing the free speech position. But the whole idea of a social media is all about network effects, right? The more people are on it, the increase in value is exponential, right? So if you have a social media site with like 4 people on it, it's worthless. It might as well be like a group chat. Like you can't reach many people when there's just 4 people. But if there's, like 3 million users on a website, then all of a sudden that's 3 million people you could reach. So the issue I see is the people who are opting out of Facebook and Twitter to go on these free speech sites that do have an honorable intention of free speech are all people who have opinions that would not be acceptable on like Twitter and Facebook. So the thing is, I'm interested in Minds. I think it's a great mission statement, but I go on there and then, you don't meet anybody who would consider themselves on the left. You rarely find people who are libertarian. It's all people who are on the right, which that's fine, but it's not a free and open. It is a free and open environment. It's just only people with a certain ideological bent have opted into it. Because the other people, like people on the left, aren't gonna be scared off Twitter because Alex Jones got banned. So I actually am kind of nervous for these free speech sites because they just aren't growing their network in a way that actually makes them truly beneficial for the average person. Even though I think it's interesting. I still go on Minds every now and then. I check it out. I don't care if I don't agree with people. I'm just like, oh, this is interesting. These people posted this thing. Okay. But I know that if the average lefty went on there, they'd be like, wow, this is a terrible place. And they would never go on it again. So the network effects of those sites and the people that they're attracting right now, just given the current climate, aren't doing them any favors. And those are the only places that are fully supporting free speech. So I think that's kind of unfortunate. That's kind of a bad side effect of this. But with that being said, Farrakhan getting banned. He's a person on the left. He's not just Alex Jones. He's an anti-Semite. People have gotten mad because he got implied that he was on the right in a couple of news articles, even though he's very much not a member of the right. But yeah, so I'm glad we're on the same page about how ideally they shouldn't ban people. Yeah, there is a lot going on there, and I feel like some regulations will probably get proposed, or maybe we'll talk more about maybe Devin Nunes. I don't know if you know about that story. Now he's trying to sue people for making accounts at his expense on Twitter. That's funny. Maybe you'll look that up. Maybe we'll talk about that next week a little bit. So there's a lot there to go into. I think we're gonna cut this episode off though, because we're rapidly approaching an hour. I think that climate change talk really we're like, it made the time just disappear for us. So we are going to be filming the next couple episodes a little bit earlier than we normally do. So forgive us if we don't cover any very important news stories that come up in the next week or so. I'm going on a trip, so it leads us to have to record early. I think we might do a very broad, overarching episode just about some of our political philosophy differences, and maybe we'll investigate our beliefs a little bit, and I think that'll be fun. And yeah, so do you want to close it out? Have some parting thoughts?
I think I'm very the more we do this podcast, the more I'm enjoying it because I actually thought in my mind, I guess I was thinking, I guess I kind of thought of myself as the lefty and you as the right-wing libertarian. I guess maybe you wouldn't call yourself that. So I kind of thought, I didn't think it would be as interesting. I just thought it would be me saying something left-wing and you saying something, right-wing libertarian-ish, and we'd, blah, 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 blah. But it's interesting because we are finding ourselves agreeing actually much more than I thought we would. And I think, I mean, I guess in the sense of if you want to listen to drama, then that's not good. But I think it's a good thing because it shows that I think we need more people who are not ruled by ideology, who try to, and I'm not trying to toot my own horn here. People who tried their hardest to think for themselves. I try to. I'm not going to say that I'm the best at it every time, but I do my best to not just follow a prescribed idea from somebody else. I think you do as well. So I hope that this brings a sort of unique perspective to this podcast that you might not find elsewhere.
Yeah,
that's my. I'll wrap it up with that.
Yeah, and just to build on that a little bit, I listen to a lot of podcasts, and I realized that there's like zero podcasts I listen to that is even remotely billed as here's two people who think they disagree, so let's talk. Because I listen to a ton of politics podcasts, and the few that have multiple people, it's just two guys who believe the same thing, and they pretty much take turns giving their arguments for why. And so it's kind of funny. Although I would call myself pretty ideological. but I'm not. I guess I'm not as hyper partisan because I do even dissent from libertarians at times, and the Libertarian Party isn't even really a cohesive framework. Well, it's not a cohesive block, really, if you look into it. So I guess to wrap this up though, you can find me on Twitter, even though we just railed against Twitter briefly. You can find me on Twitter at Matt Keck Blog. We're going to post this on SoundCloud and on the Apple Store. Feel free to, on the podcast app, subscribe to us, leave a rating, all that good stuff. So yeah, Matt and Matthew signing off.
Oh, and before we go, you can also find me on my YouTube channel, The Anti-Philosopher.
Nice.